I can offer 5 pieces of evidence in support of this contention. First, the Albany Plan, proposed by the Board of Trade, rejected by all colonial legislatures. They were happy with the status quo of local governments governing local populations. A central government that competed with these local governments was seen as a threat. This is why Americans rejected the Albany Plan in the 1750s. This is why they rejected Parliament's reforms in the 1760s and 70s. And it's why they were so fearful and resistant about the creation of the federal government in the late 1780s. Second was resistance to the Tea Act, as we already discussed. It reveals constitutional concerns about arbitrary power rather than economic resistance to high taxation. Third, the leaders of this rebellion were the rich and powerful in these colonies. These were the winners of colonial America. These people liked the status quo. The status quo was good to them. It suggests that they fought to preserve the status quo, not to change it. Fourth, in 1778, when the French entered the war on the American side, the British all of a sudden offered the Americans a peace proposal, which offered a return to the constitutional arrangement of pre-1763, before the Sugar Act, before the Stamp Act, before the Declaratory Act, before the Tea Act. This shows that the British back then, in real time, understood that this was not a tax revolt, but a constitutional crisis. That what Americans wanted all along was continued salutary neglect, the constitutional arrangement of pre-1763. Britain wasn't going to give it to them in the 1760s, or in 1774, or in 1776, but they were willing to give it now in 1778 when they faced the prospect of losing the war. And a final piece of evidence is the Articles of Confederation themselves, which recreated salutary neglect, a strong local governments under a weak central government. Until the French and Indian War, the British Empire was a loose confederation of American and Caribbean colonies. Each colony governed itself, but followed imperial instruction and leadership in matters of defense and foreign trade. The U.S. under the Articles of Confederation looked exactly like that. So I think these are demonstrable. It wasn't a tax revolt. It was a constitutional revolt to preserve salutary neglect, and it ended with the reinstatement of salutary neglect when Americans ratified the first American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. What still requires explanation is why. What made government by consent so viscerally important to them that they risked so much for it, and in the face of such great odds? Why is it that these British communities in America feared and opposed arbitrary power on principle to a degree that most of us won't oppose it even when it's actually practiced on us? This is something that Edmund Burke commented on in the 1760s on the eve of the Revolution, and which scholars like Bernard Bailyn, Jack Green, J.R. Pohl, and others have examined. I don't have the time to get into why Anglo-Americans developed such fears about arbitrary power. And even if I did have time, I don't know for sure. I'm sure it was part Protestant theology dealing with human sinfulness, part Hobbesian philosophy, part English historical experience with arbitrary power from Henry VIII through Mary and Elizabeth and through Charles I, Cromwell, James II, Robert Walpole. But I want to again reiterate that we already saw such fears on principle producing major rebellions in Old England in the 1640s and 1680s. And to these 2 English rebellions, you can add also 2 rebellions in Scotland in 1715 and 1745. So even though many at the time, and many historians today, see this fear of centralized power as uniquely American, it should actually be understood as commonly English or British. What is common to all these British rebellions, the ones in England, in Scotland, and in America, is the attachment to government by consent and a driving fear of arbitrary power. Government by consent, that is, representative government, is simply the practical solution to the central conviction in English and Scottish political philosophy or political mentality that men with power will abuse it. Men with power will abuse it. Everything else flows from this understanding of human nature. The political institutions, the procedures, the attachment to local government, the fear of concentrating power in one man or in one group of men or in one institution. All the principles on display in the British Bill of Rights, in the American state constitutions, in the Articles of Confederation, in the Federal Constitution, in the American Bill of Rights, these are all institutional manifestations of the assumption that men with power will abuse it. And like I said, this conviction that men with power will abuse it and the institutional and constitutional solutions to this problem, keeping power diffuse rather than concentrated, these were not unique to this American rebellion. They were the animating factors in 4 previous British rebellions over the preceding century, 2 in England and 2 in Scotland.